I read from page 126 in The True Rudolph Valentino by Balthasar Couet, and I quote, "It was then, in those brief hours, when he, Valentino, stopped in the city of Chicago to change trains, the famous article entitled Pink Powder Puffs, published in the Chicago Tribune, came into his hands. This article was unfair in the extreme, not only because Rudolph Valentino was virile and manly, but also because he became famous on the screen and outside of it for just that reason. It was understandable then that because of this, he experienced the most profound and transcendental anguish of his entire life. He immediately called a representative of the Chicago Herald-Examiner, a passionate competitor of the Tribune, and sent them the following letter. The letter was published in that important newspaper and attracted much attention because of the passion with which Rudolph addressed the author of the offensive piece in the Chicago Tribune, and because of the excessive emphasis the newspaper placed in dispersing it. Quote, July 19, 1926, Valentino writes, "To the man, who wrote the editorial entitled Pink Powder Puffs in the Chicago Tribune. The above-mentioned editorial is at least the second scurrilous personal attack you've made upon me, my race, and my father's name. You slur my Italian ancestry. You cast ridicule upon my Italian name. You cast doubt upon my manhood. I call you in return a contemptible coward, and to prove which of us is the better man, I challenge you to a personal contest. This is not a challenge of a duel in the generally accepted sense. That would be illegal. But in Illinois, boxing is legal. So is wrestling. I therefore defy you to meet me in the boxing or wrestling arena to prove, in typically American fashion, for I am an American citizen, which of us is more of a man. I prefer this test of honor to be private, so I may give you the beating you deserve, and because I want to make it absolutely plain, this challenge is not for the purposes of publicity. I am handing copies of this to the newspapers simply because I doubt that anyone so cowardly as to write about me as you have done would respond to a challenge unless forced by the press to do so. I do not know who you are or how big you are, but this challenge stands if you are as big as Jack Dempsey. I will meet you immediately, or give you a reasonable time in which to prepare, for I assume that your muscles must be flabby and weak, judging by your cowardly mentality, and that you will have to replace the vitriol in your veins with red blood, if there be a place in such a body as yours for red blood and manly muscle. I welcome the criticism of my work as an actor, but I will resent with every muscle in my body attacks upon my manhood and ancestry, hoping that I will have an opportunity to demonstrate to you that the wrist under a slave bracelet may slap a real fist into your sagging jaw, and that I may teach you to respect a man even though he prefers to keep his face clean. I remain with utter contempt, Rudolph Valentino. P.S. I will return to Chicago within 10 days. You may send your answer to me in New York in care of the United Artists Corporation." End quote. I understand the torment Rudolph Valentino experienced as a result of that mean and anonymously written editorial in the Chicago Tribune, the piece infamously known as the Pink Powder Puff Editorial, an editorial commentary which, according to Valentino's closest family and comrades, drove him straight into his early grave. There is a point where a person can no longer turn the other cheek. There is a point where ignoring the mean nonsense becomes impossible. There comes a point when enough is enough. On July 18, 1926, Rudolph Valentino decided his enough was enough. He was on his way east with his trusted manager and best friend, George Ullman, to attend the openings of what would be his last film, The Son of the Sheik. And it was in the Blackstone Hotel in Chicago where he reached his point of enough is enough. What would Rudolph Valentino think today to know there are people claiming to be his fans and experts on his life who allege he wrote that vicious editorial? How would he feel knowing these people believe he faked it all for publicity? I think he would be shocked and sickened, and I think anyone knowing anything about Rudolph Valentino would believe that. Who was behind the Pink Powder Puff Editorial? Recent discoveries I made while researching our new book, Norma, The Life and Death of Rudolph Valentino's Beauty Queen, led me to believe someone had a motive to attack Valentino in such a specific way. Today, who was behind the Pink Powder Puff Editorial? Today, I set the record straight about this killing event in Valentino's life.
Ciao! I am Renato Floris, the very proud publisher and author of our books on Rudolph Valentino and Natasha Rambova. I'm here today with Evelyn to discuss more about our fascinating Valentino work. Ciao, Evelyn.
Ciao, Renato. It's great to be here. As you know, my research on Norma Niblock revealed new information about Valentino and Rambova's Mineral Lava cross-country tour and the Pink Powder Puff Editorial, which so impacted Valentino's final days. I now believe, in light of my discoveries, that these two events are connected. How did the Mineral Lava Tour in 1923 inspire the devastating Pink Powder Editorial in 1926, 3 years later? To construct my premise, we go back a few years before Rudolph and his new bride Natasha took to the road in 1923, 2 more years to 1921, and the reaction to the success of Valentino's first blockbuster, The Chic. I quote from Affairs Valentino, page 81. Ministers grew red-faced as they pounded their pulpits, imploring their parishioners to avoid the temptation of the corner picture show's box office sensation, The Chic. Children were duly warned that by failing to resist any temptation to emulate The Chic, they would taint their families' respectable names forever. Rudy's audiences were intoxicated by his exhilarating new ways of making love and embraced his sensational performance as a titillating education in unheard-of displays of passion." End quote.
The Chic caused immediate problems for Valentino, with many social problems being blamed on Chic influence.
That is a fact, Renato. And one of the more quizzical manifestations of this melding of Valentino with his screen character was the use of the term caveman. This term created a dichotomy for men. There was no middle ground, no compromise. Either be a proper yet boring husband or a rough, demanding caveman in adventurous chic. The question was soon posed. What was the opposite of caveman chic? And the term caveman itself became another denigrating adjective, which I allege set a great deal in motion for Valentino, and not in a good way. Chic, lounge lizard, caveman. Valentino was called all three, but caveman would exact a heavy toll. The subject of fiery caveman romances made for copy in descriptive movie pitches, with headlines such as those promoting the George O'Brien movie The Iron Horse, which I have here, which reads, quote, "He's not a chic, a caveman, a lounge lizard, or the usual time-worn type of stage and screen hero. He is a welcome and refreshing new type of handsome, rugged, virile young man. That's George O'Brien." End quote. So chic and lounge lizards were seen as cavemen because of their behavior not sanctioned by moralistic civic groups such as church and youth organizations. The name-calling became their effort to deter Valentino's effect. Valentino hated the moniker of chic and all that implied, and how it became so ingrained in society to connotate mashing, wolfing. There are so many instances where he makes this known publicly. When he said, "I am through with chiking," to one reporter. And George Ullman in 1944 gave an interview in which he stated emphatically that Rudy abhorred the moniker. Now, cavemen added something confusing to the portrait of Valentino as the sheik because it had to do with grooming and overall civility. This was where the problem began. Don't you think, Renato, it's a sexist conundrum of strict either-or, such as is imposed on women with the Madonna or whore? Men is what? The caveman or the fastidious saint?
The caveman term meant a man who smelled badly, was not groomed or clean-shaven.
Yes, a man who was rough with women and crude and ungentlemanly in general, lacking manners and style. All things which could not be said about Valentino. He was obsessive about his impeccable clothes, his imported shaving soaps, and signature colognes, and gentlemanly by all accounts. Other than his love-making techniques in his chic films, there was not much caveman about Valentino. As I read in the opening segment, Balthasar Coué describes Valentino as, quote, virile and manly, as he explains the effect the accusations made in the Pink Powder Puff Editorial had on Valentino. Now, understanding his comment requires an awareness of the historical context of male stereotyping. Valentino was either caveman chic, having his way with women as he did on screen, or a fastidious saint who was being buried by his detractors in a sea of homosexual, and I might add, very homophobic code words and expressions. The earliest campaigns to demean Valentino were executed with homophobic slurs of the day, such as calling him overly fastidious. The term used was foppish, while at the same time he was also labeled as the caveman in chic. How confusing those insults.
Mineral lava clay would complicate that.
Exactly, Renato. With Valentino struggling to disassociate himself from either stereotype, the caveman chic or the overly groomed, his truth lay in the rubble on that battleground of nonsense about him, and in so many ways it still does. Until the Mineral Lava Tour in the spring of 1923, Valentino was predominantly cast in the role of the rough lover, the sheik. Now, the tour created a new world of torment for Valentino. It brings us to the confusing revelations. But how did this tour even come about? A bit of background. In 1922, Valentino went on strike, objecting to a myriad of issues with his employer, famous Players Lasky. Yet he remained under contract with the studio. He was unable to work in his profession, so he and his new bride, Natasha, accepted an offer from Scott's Preparations Incorporated in New York City to act as celebrity spokespeople for their skin-cleansing clay they called Mineral Lava. Rudolph and Natasha would spend a few months touring America, performing in city after city, dancing the tango, and promoting the clay. They would be paid an enormous amount of money, $7,000 a week, which by today's exchange rate would be somewhere in the range of about $100,000 a week. After each performance, a beauty pageant was held, and Valentino chose the city's most beautiful. These local winners would compete in a national pageant, which was won by Norma Niblock. Now, the entire concept of this celebrity tour was the brainchild of S. George Ullman, then an advertising consultant working for Scott's Preparations. He would travel with the Valentinos on tour, acting as road manager for the company. But at the tour's end, he accepted Valentino's offer to become his personal business manager.
Valentino was not so happy promoting that clay, but the money was incredible, and something he was not in any position to refuse.
Scott's Preparations ensured the Valentinos traveled in luxury befitting royalty in their fabulous Pullman car, which is described so meticulously in George Ullman's memoir, which you published, Renato. The hitch in that lavishly produced tour was the ad campaign itself. As it was required by contract, which Valentino signed with the manufacturers of mineral lava clay, he was forced to admit to his audiences that he used and loved the product. I cite an article from Norma, The Life and Death of Rudolph Valentino's Beauty Queen, and an account of his admitting his use of the clay during a performance. And I quote, Rudolph then stood before the microphone to deliver a speech, deploring his employer's cheap film production methods, explaining why he was on strike. A few calls echoed through the arena, "Attaboy, Rudy," and "We're behind you." Valentino ended his tirade with a sales pitch for the beauty clay, as required by the tour's promoters, Scott's Preparations. "My wife got me to try it, and I had a sensation on my face that even my barber could never give me." With this revelation, gasps were heard from the audience. To many it seemed unthinkable the man adored as the macho chic was admitting to using a woman's beauty product. No sooner had he made the stunning statement, the orchestra struck up a rousing number, and the unisex sales pitch was forgotten. End quote. Valentino did not always promote the clay and make the admission. In Elmira, New York, he did not make the dreaded mention, as reported in the Star-Gazette on April 13, 1923, and I quote, "And not once did Rudolph mention the famous beauty clay," end quote. But news the caveman chic was using a lady's toiletry product unleashed a theme which his detractors seized upon. One example, by the time the tour reached Portland, Oregon, one reporter cut loose on the subject. I cite Affairs Valentino, page 176 to 177. Nevertheless, Rudy's appearances in city after city continued to inspire highly charged opinions about his popularity. For as deftly as he had seduced millions of hormonally driven teenagers and bored housewives, he had also inspired the mobilization of anti-chic activists intent upon quashing his allegedly nefarious influence. One particular individual intent upon doing some serious quashing was the Oregonian's reporter on the beat the day the Mineral Lava Tour arrived in Portland. Prim correspondent Leon Baer was one of the few women who loathed Rudolph Valentino and believed Mr. and Mrs. Valentino were not Hollywood immortals, but Hollywood immorals. Apparently, someone tipped Rudy off to Miss Baer's low opinion of him, for at the last minute he refused to grant her scheduled interview. His snub did not bode well with Leon Baer, and this was reflected in her article in the Oregonian the following day. She mocked his Italian accent, saying, "There is gonna to be a great war soon, a war against the motion picture trusts, in which brains and art will be shed instead of bloodshed." Furthermore, she accused Rudy of effeminacy by wondering if he canceled their interview because his face was caked with the beauty clay. She titled her invective, "Cold Cream Chic Hides from Collar," with a subtitle, "Valentino, Model for Effeminate Lads, is Here." End quote. Who came up with this lamentable mineral lava ad copy? Why was the chic required to confuse the issue at all, and in essence, hand his detractors such valuable, ridiculous stereotyping ammunition? Enter Victor Vivaudou, the French perfumer responsible for marketing the mineral lava clay. A man obsessed with marketing his beauty products to men and women. Victor Vivaudou, the first to try to sell ladies' bath products and cosmetics to American men. To quote a few of his comments, "Cavemen no longer dominate the field of love," says Victor Vivaudou. The headline is, "Women Can't Believe Real Men Will Use Cosmetics." Subtitle, "Victor Vivaudou says perfumery is to take place of caveman stuff, but the idea horrible and absurd," says one matron. He goes on to say, "It is only a question of time until every man will be using cosmetics. In South America, men are using aids to beauty and attraction, heretofore employed only by women." And he goes on to explain that today's woman's love is given to the man who comes to her fresh from his barber with a well-powdered nose and a scented aroma. End quote. I would learn a lot about Victor Vivaudou, as you know, Renato, and his involvement in the tour and the clay. while researching and writing Norma, as she would also pay a price for the man's unfortunately timed ad copy. But more about that in the new book. There was no doubt, as I read the accounting, the stock reports of Scott's Preparations Incorporated at that time, that there was something, well, for lack of a better word, delusional about the company's executives and their direction taken in marketing the clay. I guess the executives were confident in their fortunes about to be made, and in January of 1923, just a few months before Valentino's cross-country tour, Scott's Preparations signed a contract, an astonishing contract, with French perfumer Victor Vivaudou, giving him $1 million a year for 21 years to act as sole marketing agent for the mineral lava clay. And that is cited to the Anaconda Standard, January 15th, 1923.
This was then the height of Vivaudou's success, as you discovered.
At the time, yes. And at the same time, Vivaudou assumed all power over mineral lava. Scott's Preparations hired George Ullman to determine why their company was not turning a profit. Hardly a mystery, in my opinion. And it was then Ullman suggested the celebrity tour as a means to save money on national full-page newspaper ads. But honestly, Renato, the outlay of cash on the contract with Vivaudou and the cost of the Valentino tour belie any rational planning, in my opinion. To turn a profit on the clay, obviously a lot of it had to be sold. Vivaudou arrived on the mineral lava scene and created his sales campaign, the ad copy, and he held all control over the clay's branding and the ad content by the time Rudolph and Natasha took to the road. Victor Vivaudou was a colorful man, to put it mildly. There's a comprehensive website devoted to him at collectingvintagecompacts.blogspot.com. Vivaudou was from the south of France and worked as a perfumer in Paris and London. In London, he married, but soon left his wife and their children to travel to America with his mistress, Rose. They lived in New York in an opulent and ostentatious lifestyle, owned a racetrack, many cars, and had a social life which made them a mention in many society columns of the day. Now, by 1922 to 1923, Vivaudou was fabulously successful, with his various lines of women's beauty products sold in artful packaging and usually sponsored by an actress whose testimonials would appear in the ad copy. But it was Vivaudou's determination to break into the male sales market that inspired his adamant advertising that the clay was a unisex product which both men and women should and could use. This was, from day one, an idea really ahead of its time, and a bad idea, and wholeheartedly rejected by the mainstream American male. It was not only rejected, but ridiculed. As Valentino took to the stage, from the first performance on the Mineral Lava Tour, his admission he used his wife's beauty product caused the stock to plummet. Men had no need for ladies' products, and women had no interest in using a product for men either. Now, the obvious question arose, which immediately handed his enemies fodder. Did Valentino really use the beauty clay?
And that is where the problems for Valentino began.
Well, Renato, crowds certainly turned out to see Valentino and Rambova dance the tango across the heartland, and the beauty pageants were a huge success. But Victor Vivaudou was a man possessed with marketing his clay as a unisex product, such as this clip from the press, and I quote, "Lipsticks for men? Why not? Of course I do not mean the kind that give accentuated coloring, but those that keep the lips moist and with natural shading. It is merely custom, after all. The man who makes use of cosmetics will be repaid 100-fold for his efforts by the greater love and affection which will be lavished upon him by the women." End quote. But sales of the clay were affected, and antagonistic press reports began using this against Vivaudou's main sales representative, Rudolph Valentino. During 1923, with sales unremarkable, Scott's preparations began to rethink that contract with Vivaudou and fought to keep their product line even viable. Vivaudou was also about to come under fire from the U.S. government for his trade practices, and I cite from Norma, page 20. Unbeknownst to most everyone except Scott's preparations executives, the United States Federal Trade Commission had just instructed their attorneys to file a lawsuit against the distributor of mineral lava beauty clay, Victor Vivaudou. The Trade Commission was but a few weeks away from charging the company with unfair trading practices, end quote. But the problem for Valentino was not trivial. The campaign to deter his influence was largely inspired by an attempt to present him as being homosexual. And this was in direct conflict rhetorically with his being called the Sheik. And this is where the caveman conundrum comes in, to create a morass of stereotyping. Vivaudou argued men needed to use his line of unisex products, or they were the equivalent of the caveman. Following his logic, it was either use my clay, make a mud pack and sit with it on your face, care about your pores, or you are a caveman. So where did Valentino position himself in this, as he acted the frontman sales representative for the clay on the tour? Was he to join the legions of cavemen, as Vivaudou called them, who did not buy the same beauty products as their women? Or was he to go so far as to admit he did use the clay and be hounded with the description of being considered effeminate? By the end of 1923, mineral lava continued to fail commercially, and Scott's preparations sought legal ways to break their contract with Vivaudou. The company spent $300,000 in the calendar year of 1923 marketing the clay. This is cited to the Brainerd Daily Dispatch, November 27, 1927. By the beginning of 1924, as Scott's signed Norman Niblock on to tour the country marketing the clay, the Federal Trade Commission filed their lawsuit against Victor Vivaudou, and Scott's was preparing to terminate the contract. The unisex ad campaign caused Vivaudou's decline professionally. In fact, his demise at that point. In 1924, he lost $450,000, half of his 1923 sales. With his term as president and general manager of his own company expiring, he was forced out of his own business in 1924. And I cite this again to collectingvintagecompacts.blogspot.com.
This is where Norma came in.
Yes. Sadly, she was kind of a last gasp effort to save the clay, a whole other story unto itself, which is told in the book. But it is surprising Scott's preparations gave Vivaudou such power over their line of mineral lava clay products. Valentino was by all first-hand accounts miserable and angry over the effeminacy slurs, and plagued by the innuendos, because of the admission he used the clay, and in many ways he still is. The fallout continues incredibly.
So, Vivaudou's professional failure was complete. At one point, he lost the ability to even run the company that bore his name.
He did, Renato, but by 1926 he was making a comeback with his line of pink powder called Mavis. Mavis was a talcum powder, and again he marketed it to a unisex demographic. It is significant to mention that he was at the time working with the Bridgeport Manufacturing Company to design and engineer a perfect dispensing machine for his pink powder, determined to sell it in personal portable containers such as a compact or a vanity box. He did produce what he called a loose powder vanity compact, and worked with the Bridgeport Manufacturing Company on other pink powder dispensing products. By 1926, mineral lava was history, and Vivaudou had nothing to do with Scott's preparations. Norma had filed her lawsuit against them for breach of contract, which is covered in detail in the book.
So, the Pink Powder Editorial. The author never came forward and for that it is still a mystery who wrote it.
Yes, Renato, but is it really such a mystery now? It was a culmination of the previous year's attacks on Valentino by his detractors, with the familiar gay slurs, but this time with the added assaults on Valentino's father and his Italian homeland. But the editorial is especially interesting in light of what was going on with Vivaudou at the time. How much more specific could that editorial be in relation to Vivaudou? But on July 18, 1926, I believe as the result of Vivaudou's endless quest to associate men with his beauty products, which impacted Valentino in such a dire way, the editorial appeared in the Chicago Tribune, which I read. Quote, "A new public ballroom was opened on the north side a few days ago, a truly beautiful venue and apparently well run. The pleasant impression lasts until one steps into the men's washroom and finds there on the wall a contraption of glass tubes and levers and a slot for the insertion of a coin. The glass tubes contain a fluffy and pink solid, and beneath one reads an amazing legend which runs something like this: insert coin, hold personal puff beneath the tube, then pull the lever. A powder vending machine in a men's washroom. Homo Americanus. Why didn't someone quietly drown Rudolph Guglielmo, alias Valentino, years ago? And was the pink powder machine pulled from the wall or ignored? It was not. It was used. We personally saw two, quote, men, as young lady contributors to the Voice of the People are wont to describe the breed, step up, insert coin, hold handkerchief beneath the spout, pull the lever, then take the pretty pink stuff and pat it on their cheeks in front of the mirror. Another member of this department, one of the most benevolent men on earth, burst raging in the office the other day because he had seen a young, quote, man combing his pomaded hair in the elevator. But we claim our pink powder beats his all hollow. It is time for a matriarchy, if the male of the species allows such things to persist. Better a rule by masculine women than by effeminate men. Man began to slip, we are beginning to believe, when he discarded the straight razor for the safety pattern. We shall not be surprised if we hear that the safety razor has given way to the depilatory. Who or what is to blame is what puzzles us. Is this degeneration into effeminacy a cognate reaction similar with pacifism to the virilities and realities of the war? Are pink powder and powder pinks in any way related? How does one reconcile masculine cosmetics, chics, floppy pants, and slave bracelets with a disregard for the law and an aptitude for crime more in keeping with the frontier of half a century ago than a 20th century metropolis? Do women like the type of, quote, man who pats pink powder on his face in a public washroom and arranges his coiffure in a public elevator? Do women at heart belong to the Wilsonian era of, I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier? What has become of the old caveman line? It's a strange social phenomenon, and one that is running its course not only here in America, but in Europe as well. Chicago may have its powder puffs, London has its, quote, dancing men, and Paris, quote, its gigolos. Down with Decatur, up with Eleanor Glynn. Hollywood is the national school of masculinity. Rudy, the beautiful gardener's boy, is the prototype of the American male. Hell's bells, oh sugar, end quote. Valentino's deep distress over this article is something well documented by those in his inner circle at the time. George Ullman wrote about it in his 1975 memoir and in the book he published after Valentino's death in August of 1926. He attributed Valentino's death to his anguish over the editorial, and I quote from Ullman. We arrived in Chicago, and the United Artists publicity man met us. He had a clipping from the Chicago Tribune, which was so virulent that it was a great shock to Rudy. That which follows is exactly what occurred that day, and I set forth these things now because of the effect upon Rudy. I believe that he grieved more about this editorial than anything ever that had happened to him before, and in fact was on his mind when he was later in the hospital during his last illness. Although we were in Chicago only between trains, we went to the Blackstone Hotel. Here I was handed the now famous editorial, which originally appeared in the Chicago Tribune. Since this scurrilous attack embittered the last days of Rudolph Valentino, killing his usual joy in living and causing him more mental anguish than any other article ever written about him, I quote the infamous anonymous attack, which I recognize as coming from the same poisoned pen which earlier in the year had, without cause and without reason, attacked my friend. End quote. And Allman makes this comment about Valentino's death, and I quote, "At 7 the operation was over, and at 10:30 he came from under the influence of the ether. I want to call attention to the entire world to the first statement Valentino made when he was conscious. Well, he said, did I behave like a pink powder puff or like a man? Which goes to prove my contention that the editorial in the Chicago Tribune had a distinct bearing on Rudy's life. And if in future editors wishing to cast slurs on those with whom they have no personal acquaintance should be restrained by this unfortunate occurrence, Valentino's suffering will not have been in vain." End quote. And we find more testimony as to the editorial's effect on Valentino in The True Rudolph Valentino by Balthasar Coué, where he writes a first-hand account of Valentino's distress, and I quote, "St. Clair also told me, and this was confirmed by those who were with Rudolph in New York in those days, that the offensive article in the Tribune, which represented him so unfairly as effeminate, contributed to his troubled state of mind. Rudolph was constantly worried that the accusation could become a permanent part of his legacy. At every moment, when least expected, he would utter some phrase relating to that unmotivated injustice and its author. While his companions talked about other things, he remained thoughtful, and suddenly, as if coming to a conclusion after some intimate reasoning, he surprised people with something like, 'Yes, I have to break his nose for that.' He, Rudolph, who was so virile, and who was deservedly respected for this virility in all the world, had to suffer the unspeakable in being represented as something he himself truly hated. Throughout those days, according to those who were with him at the time, after commenting on the unforgettable offense, he used to place his hand on his stomach and complain of pain, and the unpleasant accusation was constantly being repeated wherever he went, his friends jokingly asking him, 'How about the pink powder puffs?' Although he tried to pretend he was enjoying the joke, his disgust grew stronger and corroded his insides." End quote. Although there's no doubt as to the credibility of these professionals' statements, today innuendo is being passed off as fact. Ludicrous theories abound as to who wrote the editorial and why. One absurd claim is made that Valentino was in on the editorial and that it was a publicity stunt he approved of. Valentino needed no more publicity at the time. In fact, he was a hunted man and a victim of too much publicity. I'm sure he reviewed press releases with Allman and gave the nod, but I will state he would never have been in on or have any involvement in the creation of the Powder Puff editorial. No proof was offered for this claim other than the memory of a press agent who shared the innuendo set within quotation marks to imply some truth. This is a supposition based on nothing. Valentino would never have agreed to something that denigrated his father, never have agreed to something that portrayed him as effeminate, and would never have disparaged his country and ancestry. These are basic and serious elements of Valentino which have always been a dominant trait of his personality, and something he made public. He was extremely proud of his homeland and his parentage.
His father died when he was a little boy, and there is no way an Italian man would stand for his father to be insulted. I can say that because I am Italian. The father of Valentino was a doctor, a veterinarian, and not a gardener, which is, in my opinion, made that a racist comment.
Several points have to be made in regard to the motive of that editorial as it appeared in the Chicago Tribune on July 18th. The coincidence of the timing and the location for me point to one person, Victor Vivaudou. The Vivaudou Mavis line of pink powder, or talcum, and his history of having his unisex product lines, including mineral lava, become his ruination, and Valentino not embracing it while acting as a very highly paid representative for the clay. And it is impossible for me to not notice the mention in the editorial of the Vivaudou tagline of caveman. Was the pink powder Mavis hurled at Valentino in a sensational bid to set up some advertising launch? And where was that ballroom? And where is that powder dispenser? As you pointed out, Renato, we were unable to find any photos of a vending machine dispensing pink face powder at the time. Was this fabricated? Did Victor Vivaudou resent Valentino's success and try to generate public interest using Valentino's name once more? Did he blame Valentino for not fully utilizing his fame to promote the unisex products Vivaudou staked his reputation on? Did he use Valentino again to spark notoriety and sales of his pink powder brand? What if there was no public ballroom on the north side, no powder dispensing machine in a men's bathroom? Was this an invention? As Victor Vivaudou struggled in the summer of 1926 to keep his business and name brand alive, selling pink talcum powder and devising unique dispensing devices for said pink powder, did he levy the caveman angle at Valentino one more time? And I point out this all took place in Chicago. Everyone knew Valentino would be stopping in Chicago that day. And Vivaudou had an ad campaign for his pink powder scheduled to run in the same paper, the Chicago Tribune, the following day. On July 19, 1926, the day the Chicago Herald-Examiner published Valentino's response, we find an ad for Vivaudou's Mavis, his pink talcum powder, with the ad reading, quote, "The surpassing softness and velvety smoothness of pure Italian talc, perfumed by Vivaudou," end quote. Coincidence or not, pink powder, Valentino, cavemen, newfangled dispensers, outrage. For me, one too many connections. How much of a role did Victor Vivaudou play in the transcendental anguish of Valentino and his death soon after? Did he write the editorial or have it written? How did it come to be in the Chicago Tribune on that specific day? In the lexicon of theories about the pink powder dispensing caveman editorial, I humbly offer this podcast episode for consideration.
And find the link to our new book on Norma in the caption of this video and online on all book-selling venues, and enjoy that incredible story.
And you can hear about the book and Norma in our previous podcast on this channel.
And today, as the usual, I say Fiat Justitia, Rua Celum, and I add, enough is enough. And to the good guys, arrivederci.